Joseph Kotrie-Monson, British lawyer and broadcaster in the UK, and Mark Schnapp, who is our US lawyer and has been talking to us about all things legal from across the pond. Joseph, can I start with you? Your profession, I mean, they're great orators, they can speak well, they know how to present arguments, but does it affect their politics?
It's an interesting question, and I think it can be overstated in the UK, although I guess when you've had kind of more traditionally anti-establishment type lawyers or lawyers who take on those kind of cause célèbre type cases against large organizations, and I'm thinking actually here particularly of Keir Starmer, because although he was the director of public prosecutions, and that's perhaps what the public know him as before he was an MP, in fact, his biggest case, the highlight of his career unquestionably, was as a young barrister acting in a libel case, a defamation case where he assisted the so-called McLibel 2. And the clue's in the name, sued by McDonald's for publishing pamphlets and handing them out saying McDonald's was horrible, and they won on some points at court and lost on others. And yeah, he becomes a kind of classic lefty Matrix type, Matrix Chambers type, if you will, I guess, his career is as an anti-establishment lawyer. And of course, he joins the Labour Party. Does it necessarily follow? Well, you just look at the same example. Keir Starmer then becomes the director of public prosecutions, and prosecution is not something that you traditionally associate with those who kind of align themselves with the more kind of radical or anti-establishment, an anti-establishment approach. I think it can be overstated, certainly in the UK. While in the US, and I'm sure we'll hear from Mark, who knows much more about this than I do, having defended and prosecuted, but prosecution is very much seen as a route to power. DAs are elected, as I understand, and certainly high political and kind of government non-political office in the US is often elected, and you're expected to have prosecuted. In the UK, by contrast, we have a situation where barristers generally, not in all cases, but generally both prosecute and defend. So in that regard, I guess you have a situation where people are seen to have experience of both sides of the coin, which I think is very important. You've heard me talk of our former Justice Minister, Alex Chalk, in fact, sometimes critically on this show. He was a barrister who prosecuted and defended. I know because I briefed him to defend my clients.
Okay, let's go across to Mark Schnapp in the US. Mark, again, all of those people, I was struck by the Obamas, of course, legal eagles, and now we've got Kamala Harris and what have you. It does seem to be a path to power in the States, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does, for sure. But it's not critical. I mean, obviously, former President Trump is not a lawyer, but he will leave my comments about him separate. But I do think right now people are looking for strong legal minds. I mean, what Kamala Harris has is contrasting herself as a prosecutor with Donald Trump, who's a defendant and a convicted person. So in that way, she's sort of helping. And a lot of people are, for a time period, we're looking for people who are strong in law and order. In fact, when I was working in a private law firm, I was recruited to run for a Senate office. I decided not to, but having a prosecution background is also very helpful. But it's not critical. But I think being a lawyer is very helpful because you are. Because a lot of legal issues that are going to come up. For example, as many would recall, there's been numerous challenges to the very last election by Donald Trump. And so being sensitive to those issues is very helpful as well.
And just coming back to, and both of you have highlighted that when it is prosecution tends to be the way to go. But people like, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi, Fidel Castro, all of those people who probably have been linked with more freedom movements tend to have been defense lawyers. Let me come back to you, Joseph. You're always labeled, or you're amongst those called the lefty lawyers, what have you. But those defense lawyers tend to be at the forefront of freedom movements, rights movements, etc., and get to power that way, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, there are headlines, aren't there, in representing the little guy, David and Goliath, the underdog, call it what you will. But yeah, it's a long tradition that goes way back. I mean, just to echo and really just completely agree really with what we just heard from Mark about strong legal minds. There's a real parallel between the US and the UK, because what we really have in both jurisdictions and among both electorates is a sense of rejecting the politics of winging it. Donald Trump and, of course, Boris Johnson, while not a convicted felon or someone who faced trial in a Crown Court, he did accept and therefore admit to a criminal offence with that penalty notice that he got for those naughty parties that he was having while people were dying in hospital, unable to see their families. I think that seriousness, that understanding, and that the law, the judiciary we learn in school, it's a branch of government. Politicians, they pass the laws, and that's probably the most important role. It's not the only role of a leader, of the prime minister of a political party in power, but it's arguably the most important. And of course, lawyers are the ones who pore through those and make sure that they're properly enforced and hammer them out in court. But I think it's interesting. We've got this kind of rejection of the bluffing it and the razzmatazz, and I hate to say it, but with both Kamala Harris, if she is elected, and certainly Keir Starmer, we've got two more reassuringly reliable and perhaps even duller characters. But I think the electorate has probably decided that's a good thing.
Coming back to you, Mark, and of course the legal system in the US is very different. Let's talk about the Supreme Court, because I think people in Britain are sort of gobsmacked about how that is put together and how much power that they have. I don't think we have, and Joseph will correct me when we go back to him, I don't think we have anything that's like that, where it can be, there's political motivation about who and how the law is applied.
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, Donald Trump, when he was the president, had the ability to appoint several Supreme Court justices who are very conservative, and I'm not really sure that we would have had the same immunity result if he had not put that group of conservative justices on the court. Although John Roberts, who's the chief judge, was not was not a Trump appointee, but the group of judges who decided the presidential immunity decision primarily were conservatives appointed by Trump. So the short answer is that there is an ability of a president to shape the court, and those are permanent lifetime appointments. And, so in this case, the court is very conservative. It will be for the foreseeable time that I practice. And it affects not only judicial decisions, it affects political decisions, and many of which are going to, are surface bubbling their up to the Supreme Court now, which I anticipate if Trump loses, there'll be a series of other challenges and a lot of wasted court time by him. But yeah, the Supreme Court here, it's very, there's a lot of differences from the US and the UK system. First of all, the Electoral College is really what elects president, not the popular vote, which is sort of weird. And then there's the ability to challenge the voting system to the voters who's eligible. And there was a lot of time wasted in frivolous challenges last time. And then they've bubbled up to the appellate courts and ultimately some to the Supreme Court.
Coming back to you, Joseph, initially under the Tories, Joseph, what we found was they had put forward legislation or were suggesting legislation that would curb the rights or make it more difficult for protests and gatherings, etc., etc. Just outline that and how I'm guessing Keir Starmer, and there are many things that he probably with a legal background could see through. For instance, the whole Rwanda scheme. Even the lawyers around the Tory government, even they were saying it ain't going to work, but we'll do it just to, make smokes and mirrors. I mean, but their legals were saying this will not work. And I'm guessing Keir Starmer is looking at the stuff that the Tories wanted to bring in around the right to protest and just says this is a waste of time?
Yeah, well, some of it's gone through and some of it hasn't over the last 3 or 4 years, hasn't it, previous to the Labour government? And the strange thing is that there was, or the interesting thing, I should say, is there was a lot of sympathy from the public about the extent to which a certain type of protest, which isn't just about making your voice heard or making a noise or exercising your right to have your opinion voiced in circumstances where you feel democracy and the democratic system has let you down, which is basically that release valve that protest represents. Rather, we were seeing a new species of protest, which was about gluing yourself to buildings, stopping traffic, sometimes stopping cars to the extent that people were affected in ways that really didn't garner a great deal of sympathy. The idea of, we've talked about it, ambulances not being able to get to hospitals, that kind of thing. But there was a sense, certainly among many lawyers, that there was a real sense of overreach, widening of definitions to include annoyance. Well, protest is kind of supposed to be annoying, isn't it? If protest isn't at least annoying and it isn't allowed to be at least annoying, where do we end up? And I think also the use of delegated powers of the minister in the legislation, to the extent that the minister could allocate or decide off the cuff, without reference to Parliament, what represented in particular circumstances annoyance, and it to be defined according to that particular person's opinion. When you're talking about a really important constitutional right, the right to assembly, the right to freedom of speech. Well, there was a sense of overreach there. I actually think, however, that while Keir Starmer, the elements of that legislation, those various efforts of legislation that did go through, that the Tories got their that Labour were happy to criticise them for, that the Tories got their hands dirty with and waded through the kind of moderate and left-wing criticism. I think that some of it, being a cynic about government in general, especially a centrist government, that really is kind of about trying to please a large part of the electorate the most and stay in power, that probably Keir Starmer is quite happy to have inherited the parts of that legislation he has.
Oh, without getting his paws dirty, so to speak.
Absolutely, without having to tinker it and benefit from it.
Yeah, and here's the interesting thing, coming back to you, Mark Schnapp. I was alarmed to see that one of the things that Donald Trump has mooted before, he said he would use soldiers against riots, crimes and migrants. Now, the Insurrection Act, and I suppose this is where there's a slight parallel, there is a part of it, if I'm not wrong, where you don't have to talk to the governor of that state. So just talk us through what this insurrection, it goes way back. It's that you can call in troops, and they have been called in before, haven't they? I'm thinking like Rodney King and the riots, LA riots and what have you. But Trump has sort of talked about this quite openly, and he's admired dictators for being strong, even, Tiananmen Square, call them rioters and what have you. There is a worry, is there not, that if he was to get into power again, that he would use this, not when a governor said, we need help, we need the troops sent in, but he could kind of use part of this legislation to leapfrog them.
Well, you know, the irony is that at the end of his term, he's the one who encouraged rioting and what would amount to insurrection, in my mind. And, you know, so the thought that the same person who encouraged riots led to many people being prosecuted and gone to jail would then take the position later that he, as a potential dictator, as you expressed it, would call in the troops to quell riots, take over migrant situations, any number of situations where he would, you know, people would go crazy if he actually tried to do that, because that would be, in my judgment, way too far. And I think that would be a real fear. This whole concept of him being a quote unquote dictator is in fact a fear on certain elements of the citizenry here. But no, you're right. I mean, there's a real concern that he would, instead of the situation where a governor would say, hey, we need help, send in your troops, that he would do that, he would abuse that, but yet not do it when it would be appropriate, like he didn't do in the Washington, D.C. riots, when he actually was encouraging people to go to march on the Capitol to take back, you know, the election, and didn't call the troops. So, I mean, think of the horrible parallel that would create.
But here's the thing. If in a situation like that, it went to the Supreme Court, and as you said, they're there for lifelong, you know, whichever government gets in is going to have to deal with them. How can the law be applied? And I'm thinking with Roe versus Wade. Can the law be interpreted at that level in a way to assist the person who appointed you? For instance, if the Democrats get in, if they ever had any appointees, managed to get any appointees to the Supreme Court, is there a way of interpreting the law to suit your, what can I call it, your benefactor, for better, you know, way of putting it?
Well, theoretically, a judge is supposed to be impartial, but
yeah,
you know, there are certain philosophies that a conservative, a Republican appointee might have. For example, they would be more inclined to go to what's called original interpretations of the Constitution, you know, limiting rights. But so the answer is, it would not, the philosophies of the appointees might affect their decisions. Like, you're right, with Roe versus Wade is a good example, where, you know, the abortion rights was severely limited, and in fact delegated to the states. But but you're right. I mean, it's really a question of whose judicial philosophy is going to affect future decisions, right? And in theory, you're not supposed to ask a judicial candidate, whether it be for the Supreme Court or any court, what they would do in a given situation. Now, I will tell you, in my own experience, when I applied to be a judge when it was a Republican administration, I was asked what my positions would be on certain things, which they weren't supposed to do, but they did it.
Wow. Let's coming back to you, Joseph, as well, and let's look at some past legislation. And I touched upon that before. When it came to the whole Rwanda scheme and what have you, and the legals, the millions that were spent on that. Do you think if there had been somebody with a legal background in a very senior position amongst the Tories, that would have been sort of killed right at the beginning?
I don't think so. And the reason for that, and I'm not a political commentator, but the Tories had a huge majority. They had their leader, Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, had a mandate to do what he wanted. And that meant that he would have had an Attorney General, he would have had a Justice Secretary who were picked to agree with him. And I think in that regard,
just coming back on that, we can't criticise the US because the same damn thing happens in Britain.
You're spot on, Trisha. And while I do look on, because it's so obvious because of the fixed Constitution of the United States, it's in a written document. Ours is a kind of collection of traditions. It's regarded as more flexible. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes less so. But the power of the Supreme Court over the interpretation of legislation, that's something which kind of gives us the heebie-jeebies over here when we see it in action over in the US. And that direct presidential control that we've heard about from Mark with regard to the election of those very senior judges. But you're right, the UK, it's not completely fine and dandy, it's not completely pure, and it'd be really naive to imagine that it was. Do you remember when Boris Johnson kept trying to prorogue Parliament to time it out so he could get his Brexit stuff done? And Geoffrey Cox, the then Attorney General in Parliament, a lawyer, shame on him, I have to say, threatening that if Parliament didn't vote the way that government wanted it to, and if the Supreme Court didn't do what they wanted to do, they would look at interference with the process by which those people were either chosen or limiting their powers. This is serious constitutional stuff. But at the same time, you know, when you have King's Counsel, it's easier to become a King's Counsel if you have prosecuted. That's the most senior brand of lawyer. And who's it given by? A committee, but heavily influenced by the Lord Chancellor's office. Similarly, the judiciary. If you want to be a judge, it's more likely if you've been a prosecutor, certainly not a renegade left-wing lawyer, you'll get that tap on the shoulder. It's behind closed doors. It's more subtle. They're not necessarily lifetime appointments, and certainly those lifetime appointments in the Supreme Court, and certainly you don't get that kind of that huge unimpregnable power that it seems that the Supreme Court justices have over the legislature. But it would be wrong to naive just because we do it over here in a slightly more sophisticated and subtle and not so obvious. And probably, I have to say, with respect to to Mark and the US legal system, which I follow intently, I have to say, from over here. Despite all that, I think that it's probably less overt and sometimes a little bit less disturbing than what we see, for example, every 4 years over the last couple of elections. Certainly, we saw it with Bush in Florida, didn't we? Over those few hundred votes. Mark's right. We see the lawyers. We see the lawyers rolled out at the benefit of the politicians, and the judges sometimes seem to act politically, and that's rather sad.